Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast. I'm your host, Hamza Islam, and this is a podcast where I talk to Gen Zers who are making a difference in their communities about their journey and how they became the person they are today. While every one of us have an end goal or a destination we want to reach, we cannot underestimate the importance of talking about one's story and the things that have shaped them into the person they are today and who they want to be in the future. My goal for each episode is that you, the audience, join me in learning a few things about each guest on this podcast. And as we continue to write our own story and think about how we want to be remembered. And I know this is the first time I've introduced my podcast this way, but I do want to let people know why I do things the way I do. And also because I have a great support team that have suggested this is a great way to start this podcast. So shout out to my team, and I hope to continue to do this in the future so people know what they're listening to. Now, going to my guest this week, my guest is Ishaan Shah, who is the founder of Stolen Dreams and the co-founder of the Youth for Freedom Collective. And these organizations look to spread awareness about the issue of modern slavery. And it's interesting because as someone from the United States, it's very easy to forget that slavery is still an issue. And while we don't have an image of it, there is still a weird way people work around it. And the fact that Ishaan is still talking about it is really important to see. And in addition, he is also the United Kingdom youth representative to the United Nations, where he doesn't just focus on the on modern slavery, but he also focuses on gender equality. I know that's a lot, but that is so much to be involved in. But I'm really glad to have Ishaan as a guest on this podcast. So, Ishaan, thank you so much for joining the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a really pleasure to be here.
Yeah, of course. And before we start talking about activism, one of the things that I was really excited about is the fact that you have a British accent. And that's one of the few things that I wish I had on this podcast because I don't know about you. I know you meet people all over the world, but I feel like whenever I talk to someone who has a British accent, I guess I feel like there's all the more reason to be able to listen to them. I don't know how that's you see yourself, but whenever I see someone who has a British accent, I'm just so inclined to see what they have to say. That's just me.
No, that's so. I've heard that before from a lot of American friends, so it's a common sentiment, I think. But I think as with many people, I just hate listening to my own voice. But
Yeah, I think a lot of us have that too, where we'll be like, I hate the sound of my voice. But then when other people talk or whenever other people hear us, they're like, wow, your voice is so professional. But I don't know. Maybe we're just we can be our worst enemies in a way. But
exactly.
I do want to talk about before we talk about, or I want to talk about the issues that you're involved in, but more specifically how you started, because I feel like I was talking about the gender equality and and modern slavery. I don't know if these issues were something that you're impacted directly, but I feel like, well, when it comes as someone who describes themselves as a feminist, it's very easy as a man to, I guess, not feel like it can be awkward for men to be involved in it because they're so worried about what other people might think of them. And then also with modern slavery, it's an issue that just because people don't talk about it doesn't mean it's still not an issue, if that makes sense. So I
Mhm.
want to ask you what it is about gender equality and modern slavery that allowed you to really get involved in this field in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the motivation behind gender equality, I mean, gender equality is an issue that affects all of us. We come from mothers. I have a younger sister. It affects them in so many different ways, so many disproportionate ways too. So growing up, I've been brought up by my mother, my grandmother, and really from a young age, they've instilled those values of selflessness, of service to others, in everything that I've done from a very young age. And so when I first found out that modern slavery existed, and that was in 2016, when I was 13 years old, I was shocked because at school we were taught that slavery was abolished back here in the UK in 1833 and that it was eradicated from the face of the earth. I had been to India growing up. I had met children who were vulnerable to or, had survived modern slavery, but I had no idea what that meant at the time. And so when I was finding this all out when I was 13 years old in 2016, I was shocked because modern slavery isn't an issue happening in faraway countries and faraway communities, but it's happening on our doorsteps in the clothes we wear, in the foods we eat, the technology that we use, and potentially even on our high streets. And so this is a very much a very prevalent issue, a very big issue that's close to home. It's one that we're encountering every day, but it's also one that disproportionately affects women and girls too. The data suggests that one in every 130 women and girls globally is in modern slavery. And this is really a shocking statistic. But it's also the notion that all of these issues are interconnected. Modern slavery is deeply interconnected to climate change, it's deeply interconnected to gender equality. But it's the recognition that advancing gender equality is beneficial for everyone. And I think this also goes to my definition of what is feminism. Why do I call myself a feminist? And it's because I look at feminism as a way of dismantling and deconstructing those systems that perpetuate violence, marginalization, discrimination, the very systems of patriarchy and privilege that, I myself as a man benefit from at the expense of others. So feminism, goes beyond just a conventional sense of equality of the sexes, for example, as it's often defined, but it goes and sort of explores ways in dismantling those systems, but also beyond just gender, but looking at things like decolonizing approaches, looking at things like racism and sexuality and caste and class, and seeing how those all intersect with each other too.
Yeah, it is interesting to be able to see how much how I don't want to say the for lack of a better word, confusing it is, because you think of, when it comes to slavery, you're just, and I mean, I can only relate to this because, I mean, it's from the United States. Slavery was abolished in the 19th century, or the 1800s, but then you realize, wait a minute, it's still happening. And then, with, as I think one of the things, and I had a few other guests where we talked about how feminism isn't just a gender issue, it's a human issue, because women do play a part in our lives. Now, I do want to talk about when you first started. I know as an activism, you have a lot of challenges in trying to spread awareness about issues, and sometimes they go your way, don't go your way, and everything else. But when you first started and trying to get out of your comfort zone, was it weird telling, or yeah, was it weird telling people what you're involved in? Because maybe not necessarily the child or the slavery issue, but as someone who is a feminist, telling people like, hey, I want to be involved in this issue, did you often get awkward looks from people like, Ishaan, why are you in this space in the first place? Like, this isn't an issue that should really bother you as much, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I think, when we started in 2000, well, we launched Stolen Dreams in 2017. And, even today, the reason we launched Stolen Dreams is because we noticed there's a disconnect between young people and the mainstream anti-slavery sector. The climate movement was bringing in young people. We saw people taking to the streets, young people really leading that frontline grassroots push for climate action. The gender movement was bringing in young people through programs like He for She, for example. But the anti-slavery sector was very much in its own bubble, very much reserved for the academics, for the people who are collecting the data, and the so-called experts in the field who have been analyzing and studying this issue for decades. And so there wasn't interaction with young people, or if there was, it was more just, here's something you can post on social media, here's some awareness raising you can do. It didn't go beyond that. It didn't go into how young people can actually take action in their communities or be centered in decision-making processes. And so when we started Stolen Dreams, it was essentially for that reason, was to bridge the mainstream sector with young people, to get more young people aware of what modern slavery is, to have that consciousness as to how it manifests today, and also how it links to history as well. And as you so rightly mentioned, the very forms of exploitation we see today are the legacies of historic slavery. When slavery was abolished historically, it gave way and gave rise to new forms of exploitation in the form of contracted labor and indentured labor, that was specifically targeted, at least in a UK context, to exploiting people of Indian and Chinese descent. And those are the very forms of exploitation we see that exist today. And really that points to, the term modern slavery is a very politicized term as well. And the fact that you added the word modern to it somewhat distracts you from the historic connections of slavery. But in essence, those very fundamental forms of exploitation in terms of coercion, deception, and abuse of power, and exploiting someone are so deeply ingrained in our socioeconomic and political fabrics, and they have been over centuries. And so coming into this space as a young person, I mean, even today as a 19-year-old, and coming with this narrative, this And it's disruptive, but I like to see it as constructively disruptive, because we're coming in with this new fresh perspective. We're coming in and we're telling partners and established people and organizations in this space that actually we as young people, we're not here to hinder your processes. We're here to support. We want to, and we already are leading on the front lines. And we know that children are disproportionately impacted by modern slavery. We know that as climate change, as conflict, as the impacts continue from the COVID-19 pandemic as well increase, we know that the rates of modern slavery are going to increase and that more young people are going to fall into exploitative conditions. Also recognizing that it's not just the traditionally vulnerable people who are at risk of modern slavery, but anyone is at risk of modern slavery, particularly with the rise of social media and with all these technological innovations and developments too. And so really that's one of the main challenges. You come into the space, you say your age, and you're often dismissed straight away, or you're told, great, you're doing a great job. And beyond that, there's nothing else, there's no support. And really what we're calling for is for young people to be centered in decision-making processes, recognizing that we're not only beneficiaries of anti-slavery efforts, but we're partners at the table, and we should be co-leading processes from design phases to implementation and beyond.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I guess for our generation, for now, we are often told, "Yeah, great, you're doing great, but we'll see you in a few years." Or it's, "Yeah, we don't want to thank you for dreaming, but we'll take it from here." But it's very important. You kind of mentioned how we don't want to wait 4 or 5 years. We want to be part of this now, and I think that's what is oftentimes it's very easy for generations above us to underestimate the power that we have and whatever. And yeah, we have our strengths and we have our weaknesses, but let's work on what we can do so that we can make better, not just for our generation but for generations after us. And sometimes it's very easy for people, and I know you probably have this all the time when you're someone who's a part of the United Nations, where it's so easy for older generations to underestimate the importance and the impact that young people, especially young people, can have on society. And I want to talk about, and one of the things I connected with you when I first met you is that you are South Asian. And so it was really cool to be able to share that moment. Now, just for context, my parents are from Bangladesh, and I think your parents are from India, or you have Indian background. I want to ask you, because, and I don't know if this is something that you face, but in my community, when we are, I guess, trying to create our own path, whether it's creating our organization or spreading awareness about an issue, it's not that people don't support us. It's just that they're like, well, what's the end goal? What are you, or is everything gonna, are you gonna get the most money? Are you gonna have a safe life and everything else? And it's interesting because you don't want to, you're looking at, I mean, yes, this is an important issue, but sometimes they're like, oh, you'd rather take the engineering route. You should take the law route. You should take the doctor or medical route, whatever that may be. When growing up, was that something that you faced as well? Like you should take the traditional path. Nothing wrong with it specific personally, but it's like there are other ways to define success, not just taking these routes, but being able to like look at some of the issues that are impacting the world and trying to, I guess, save generations after us from being fall to victim in any way.
Mhm. No, that's a really great point, and one that I get asked this a lot as well. And I think I've been very fortunate in the sense that my parents and my grandparents have really just told me to follow what I'm passionate about doing. Obviously, stay grounded, stay don't sort of drift off, be realistic about what you want to do with your life. But in that sense, they've been really supportive, and I think it also points to one of the things that we do when we go into schools and we teach young people, and particularly those who are in university, for example, who are looking into what careers they want to go into, or coming to the end of high school, is really just embedding that consciousness as to people and planet before profits into their, and it's very cliche to say, but sort of embedding that consciousness into their thinking. Because at the end of the day, I might go into the private sector, for example. I might go and become a human rights lawyer. I might go and work on an NGO level, a grassroots level. I don't know what's going to happen when I finish university. The world is changing so rapidly. Some jobs that will exist in the next 2, 3 years haven't even been created yet. So it's everything's changing, everything's shifting. And I think just for me having that open mind, and again, very privileged way of thinking to say that I can have an open mind as to what I want to do when we know that there are, already children who are having to, work rather than go into education. And that's a reality. But I think in terms of like the anti-slavery sector in particular, I mean, when I started Stolen Dreams, I knew that I was committing to a lifetime of working in this space, of working to eradicate modern slavery. That's where my passion is. That's where my roots are. That's where my heart lies. And I think in any of the spaces I occupy, and in any of the spaces that other people occupy too, there are so many ways that you can tackle modern slavery, whether that's in corporates and looking at supply chain due diligence, or going into the police force and being a frontline sort of responder in terms of healthcare as well, looking at how you can use mental health and psychological support to give or to provide support to survivors of exploitation. There are so many different ways, and I think one of the things I'm so fortunate to have had growing up is that freedom and that flexibility to pursue my passions. But also, I was taught as well from a very young age to have a healthy relationship with failure as well. Knowing that failure is an inevitable part of life. You're going to change careers, multiple times in your lifetime. You're going to like things, you're not going to like things. And it's all about that whole process of acknowledging what you're feeling, acknowledging, how you're feeling in these situations, but also that process of learning, unlearning, and then subsequently growing as a result of it.
Yeah, actually, I really want to talk to you about that. Before, I want to talk a little bit more about South Asian cultures and just a little bit more about what I just asked. But I do want to focus on the failure part. And as an activist, as someone who's involved in this, do you feel like this is the one thing you have learned about being an activist is that you are going to fail, or do you feel like failure is just rather a component, not or failure is one of the things, but maybe not necessarily the major thing you've learned as an activist?
Yeah, I mean, failure is not just part of activism, it's just part of everything one does in their life. And I think in an activist context, failure as when you're learning from your mistakes after you failed, I think it's very constructive because you're bound to fail in activism. You're going to lobby someone and they're not going to listen to you, or you're going to do a campaign that may not kick off, or put out some sort of messaging that people won't understand and they have no idea what you're talking about. Failure and making mistakes and facing challenges is an inevitable part of an activist journey. Um, it can be demoralizing at times, and that's the truth. When something doesn't go right, or you put so much time and energy into something and it just doesn't get where you want it to go to. But I think it's a process. It's recognizing that we're in this for the long game, and that to see systemic and structural change, which is a lot of which is what a lot of activists are calling for, is going to take time. These are placed in centuries or been in place for centuries, and the very people who have the power to dismantle them are the people who benefit from them. And it's really about acknowledging that if you do fail, take some time to have a breather, give yourself credit for the work you've done, but then critically analyze what you've done. Think about what went well, what didn't work, what didn't go well. Speak to others in the community, speak to your target audience and the people who you had designed that project for example, and really center their voices. But ultimately, it's about not giving up. It's about not getting so burnt out and demoralized that you give up on activism completely, but taking that time to take care of yourself too. And in this process, I mean, everyone talks about self-care and everybody talks about the fact that if you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of others. And as much as that's paraded around, it really is true, because burnout is real and it's exhausting. And we face it so many times, burnout, and how you don't want to even get out of bed in the mornings. And we can't have that, because we need young people on board. We need young people who are really passionate about these issues, doing their own thing in their communities, sustainably.
Yeah, I think, and you talked about this a little bit when you were talking about how sometimes with social media it's so easy to be a victim of slavery, and oftentimes because of social media we fall into this comparison game where we look to a person on our left or our right and we go, oh, they're doing better than us. That means we're failures, like a complete failure. And one of the things I've always talked about on this podcast is that everyone has their own respective journeys, and one of the things you cannot afford to do is assume that everyone is better off than you. Like I can't assume that just because you're doing this that everything is 100% going your way.
Mhm.
There are things that don't go your way, and now it's about, okay, how do you learn from that? And I also think that we as humans, we want to be perfect, especially if we want to prove to others that we do deserve to have a seat at the table and whatever it may be. But I also think sometimes it is better to have things not go your way, so you can think about, okay, what went right, what went wrong, and what can we do in the future so that we don't make that same mistake again. Because I do think you grow more from failing than succeeding, if that makes sense. I don't know. That's just what I'm thinking right now.
No, exactly. And it's to your first point that you made in terms of activism isn't a competition. It's not about who can, it's not about speaking at the UN, for example. It's not about changing the law. It's not all about who has the most likes or followers on social media, who is a verified activist on social media and who's not. The essence of activism, if you look at it, and I think one of the examples I give is, you're guided by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which outline those 17 goals, and they talk about things like gender equality, they talk about things like eradicating poverty. And if you really look at those target indicators, it all starts from the grassroots level. It starts from the community level. It starts from you as an individual dismantling those harmful, I don't know, gender norms and stereotypes that you may have internalized. It's about, in the spaces that you occupy within your family at the dinner table, for example, or within your school and within your friend groups. That's where activism is, because it really happens at that grassroots level. And inevitably that's going to ripple out and affect the wider community. Um, so yeah, you're so right in saying that it's not about comparing, it's about finding your niche, the area that you're passionate about most, and doing whatever you can, no matter how big or small it might be.
Yeah, I mean, and I think and when you have people like yourself being able to say that it's not about a comparison, it's about working together. Because if you do fall into that comparison thing, then it's like, then what are you actually in it for? Like if I'm trying to create an organization similar to yours, I don't want to go, I want you guys to join my organization, because then it feels like I'm part of the problem now instead of the solution. So I think being able to say that, seeing it as a human issue rather than just a me versus, it's like we should see an issue as everyone versus the problem versus me versus Ishaan or whoever that may be. So I think once we develop that mindset, then it makes things so much easier. But because of social media, it can always be, it is
Exactly.
sometimes a weird place to be in.
It's taking a step back, it's detaching yourself and thinking, why are you really doing what you're doing? Are you doing it because you want to receive recognition or an award, or because you want your organization's logo stamped on something? And for some people it is about that, and it shouldn't be. And for us, it really isn't. And we take pride in being, or we take pride in doing our activism from the background, because and for some organizations, it's right. You need to put your word out there. You need to be active on social media, because essentially that's where funding comes from, and funding is the main obstacle that we as young activists face. Is there's just not enough of it that's accessible and that's flexible and sustainable. But it's really about understanding why you're doing activism. Why do you want to do this? And for many of us, it's because it's a lived reality. It's what we're fighting for. It's for many of us, it's a life or death situations. And we interact with people who are directly impacted, by modern slavery and human trafficking. Particularly, we speak to survivors every day, and we're in it to end it. Essentially, we're committing to a lifetime of working in this space, and we're committing to a lifetime of ending modern slavery in all the work that we do.
Yeah, no, that's I really love the fact that, like I said, you just want to be able to work together and think about why you're doing things, and why you're doing the things that you do. Are you doing it because of the recognition, or are you doing it because you see an issue and you want to hopefully bring more people in trying to tackle whatever that issue may be. Now, I want to transition to the United Nations, because when I first met you, I thought it was really cool that you were able to work with such a respectable organization, but then also an organization that sometimes people don't understand, and so they'll go, the United Nations don't do anything. But I'll talk about that later. Instead, I would love to talk about how you first got involved in the United Nations and what it's like to be able to work with leaders around the world. Because I feel like while you are you're in the discussion table about talking about issues that are impacting around the world, I feel like there's also a child in you where you're like, oh, I get to work with some of these amazing people, um, for a number of reasons.
Yeah, no. Growing up, you always taught the UN is a great institution, and that it's advancing its three pillars of human rights, peace and security, and development. Sorry. Um, UN is an interesting institution. It's obviously member state driven, so it's the governments that are taking the lead, the 193 or so member states that take the lead. And inevitably, even the way the system was constructed is got so many institutional flaws and failings in terms of the way it works. And I mean, we can see that right now with the whole war in Ukraine and how Russia has, taken the presidency of the Security Council for this month. I mean, it's absurd to think that this is happening. But also just in terms of all the other various aspects that are going on in the world and the conflict and climate change and the accountability or the lack of accountability that is being placed on states. But nevertheless, the UN does do good work. It's not just a useless organization. Despite its many flaws and structural limitations, the work that it does do. And I think the work that young people are doing in terms of engaging with the UN and really localizing that agenda, which is the key part of our work, is bringing what the UN is doing to the grassroots level is so crucial, because at the end of the day, what the UN's fundamental aims, the sustainable development goals, it's whole, the way the UN is built, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are crucial. That's the bare minimum that we should be expecting of the world. But my engagement started in 2021. I knew what the UN was before that, didn't quite know anything else except that it was called the United Nations, and that's about it. So in 2021, I was invited to speak at a parallel event during the UN's 65th Commission on the Status of Women, which is the largest intergovernmental gathering globally to advance gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. In fact, I think it's the largest UN gathering, so it's even bigger than the General Assembly that happens in September, but it's the largest UN gathering that happens every year. But I was invited to speak at this parallel event on the 65th session. It was at the peak of the pandemic, so it was all virtual and on Zoom. The acronym for the Commission on the Status of Women is CSW. So when I was invited to first speak, I Googled CSW, and it came up with a Christian organization at the top. So I thought I was speaking at a faith event. I didn't realize I was going to be speaking at a UN event until a bit later on, when I received a more formal invitation from the organization that was hosting it. But it was at this commission and at this event that I met a bunch of incredible young activists who are working with UN Women in particular on UN Women's Generation Equality forums, on strengthening their youth engagement and participation. And within the next few months, I was working alongside these young people and on the generation equality forums, but specifically on how there was a lack of youth engagement and looking at what does young people's meaningful engagement actually look like, but how can we go beyond that and look at young feminist leadership. And we held sort of like a little side conference for young people. We co-authored a beautiful document called the Young Feminist Manifesto, which essentially forms the basis of all our advocacy even today on what leadership at the UN in terms of young people should look like, built on those principles of co-creation, co-ownership, and co-leadership. And yeah, from there, we just fell into the UN system, fell into the UN world, particularly focusing on the gender equality side of things. And then I wear a number of different hats in the UN system today. Youth focal point for the review and implementation of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which is a mouthful, with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Again, a position that I hold because as Stolen Dreams, we reached out to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime because they hold the mandate in the UN system for combating trafficking in persons. And we told them, you're not doing enough to engage young people in particularly in decision-making processes. Can we hop on a call? Can we discuss this further? And last year was a big year for youth in terms of the UN, because we had a lot of structural changes. So we have the new UN Youth Office being created at the moment. There is the big Summit of the Future happening in 2024. There is the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG Summit happening in September, which is the midpoint for the SDGs, which are meant to be achieved in 2030. They were agreed back in 2015, so this is the 7.5-year mark. And various other processes happening. But essentially, all the work we do at the UN is, well, one, to make sure that young people are being centered in terms of leadership positions and in the intergovernmental processes, making sure that our voices are being heard in those negotiations that are happening at the UN, which often happen behind closed doors in New York or in Geneva or Vienna or the respective UN sort of headquarters that are there. It's a very exclusive space, a very privileged space, only for the member states, only for the governments. So really making sure that young people's voices are being heard in those spaces. But, as I mentioned previously, importantly, localizing the agenda and recognizing that to engage with the UN in itself is a huge and tremendous privilege. and that a lot of young people just don't have trust in the UN as an institution. So how do we bring that agenda to the grassroots level? How do we make it accessible? How do we get rid of all the UN jargon that is often used, and really bring it to the level in which young people engage with it, but also go beyond the resolutions that are being churned out every week by the UN, but actually look at implementation. What does that look like on the ground? But importantly, accountability on the states that are subscribing to these commitments.
Yeah, I love the fact that even though you're a part of the United Nations, you just don't you're not stopping. You're constantly trying to find ways to improve the United Nations, trying to bring youth to the table. And it was kind of like I'm going to talk a little, and I want to bring back when you were talking about the why you do things, because it's not about getting to a specific destination. It's that you want to continue to use the tools you have to continue to bring more people into the conversation. So I think it's really cool to be able to see that you don't you don't want to just see yourself succeed, but other people succeed, because like you've mentioned before, young people do play a role in society, and that if we want to continue to make the world a better place, everyone needs to be on board. So I love that. And before I let you go, I do want to talk about a few things regarding your activism. Firstly, I want to bring back the South Asian part where we were talking about the whether you should take the traditional route and not and whatnot. But as someone who's involved in gender equality and slavery, what is it like having these discussions, whether it's in South Asian countries or with people in general? Because I feel like there's one of two options you face with, which is one, people deny it because they're worried that they are a victim themselves, and if they speak up, then their life is in danger. Or secondly, they think that you're crazy, that you're going into these issues. So what has it been like being involved in these issues, involved in this, and how difficult is it to try to tell people, or try to get people to understand where you're coming from?
The thing is with slavery is that it's a structural issue, it's a systemic issue. In India, for example, there is every form of modern slavery. This is an issue that is deeply rooted in Indian societies, in Indian politics, in the Indian economy. And of course, the legacies of colonialism have had an impact on that, and had a direct consequence as to the situations of vulnerability that people are in now in Indian context. But also, like, to address modern slavery, one of the key components is addressing, gender inequalities. And, in South Asian cultures in particular, those gender inequalities are embedded in our cultures as well, right? They're embedded in the way that we interact with each other. And that means that it often means that you have to challenge people at a very individual level as to their conceptions of what is gender, what is sexuality, how does that intersect with caste and class and race. And that means telling people some very uncomfortable truths, some very hard truths that need to be heard though. And I think when we interact with those type of communities, and it's not just South Asian people, it's people in general who hold these internalized biases. When you tell them things about gender, about sexuality, about caste, they feel uncomfortable because they have been conditioned, or they've been brought up in a way, and they've been taught certain things. And it's not about disregarding their voices. It's not about telling them you're wrong, change, or bullying them into thinking a certain way, but it's about getting them to understand what is their thinking, why is their thinking potentially harmful to the people around them, and how can they work on dismantling that internalized attitude, for example. And it's hard because you do face a lot of pushback, and that's inevitable. And when you're trying to push forward an agenda, or when you're trying to push forward a narrative that is new, that is disruptive, that is shaking the system, you're going to get pushback inevitably, whether you're engaging with your average young person who's going to a school, for example, or a decision maker who's in a position of power. Because at the end of the day, why the thinking is why would you want to dismantle a system that benefits you? And that's exactly what the patriarchy is it's a system built by men. We live in a system, in a world built by men for men, but we may have not picked up the tools to build the patriarchy, but doesn't mean that we can't we can't dismantle it. At the end of the day, it's about understanding that gender equality, it's a way of understanding that ending modern slavery, that advancing sustainable development will benefit everyone. It will. And we can promise you that the evidence is clear, and it's a long road, it's a tough road, but it just requires people to sit in that feeling of uncomfort, sorry, to really think about your own internalized opinions, but also committing to work towards dismantling them. And it really takes that individual will. We talk a lot about the need for political and corporate will, which is essential because it's governments and it's corporates that are perpetuating these inequalities a lot. But it also requires an individual will to think about, what is the privileges that you hold? What is the power that you hold in the spaces that you occupy? And how can you use that privilege and power to dismantle those very systems that continue to perpetuate violence, marginalization, inequality, discrimination, that impact the people around you, and in particular the women and girls around you and the gender diverse people around you.
Yeah, and there were so many things that you said that I think we should need to understand or should or probably have talked about, which is that whatever you do, it's going to be a long, tough journey. There's going to be pushback. There are going to be things that people don't understand, even though you're trying to raise awareness about an issue, whatever that may be. Now, my last question, and this is going to be my last question, and I want to speak to you as a human being. If when it comes to human rights, you obviously are going to face a lot of pushback, but sometimes that pushback can go very extreme to the point where your personal life could your safe your the safety of you could be in question. Has that something you've ever faced with personally, and if so, how do you try to handle that? Because this goes back to your why, where you're like, I'm doing this because I see an issue, but because people are trying to criticize me and whatever that criticism may be, sometimes I have to second guess, or not second guess, I guess I have to think about it twice before I continue to do something like this.
We're seeing across the world that human rights defenders, environmental defenders are being persecuted, being arrested, unlawfully, being killed even. And this is a reality for millions. It's a reality for young people that we work with. I have friends in countries where they cannot use Twitter, for example, in a certain way. They can't use WhatsApp in a certain way. They can't speak out against the state because the next day a bulldozer will turn up outside their home or they will be arrested. So, and this is something that actually, when we engage with the United Nations with, is something that something that I take very seriously, and something that I keep in mind all the time, is that I'm very privileged to be able to interact with my government and to be able to exercise accountability, to be able to call them out, to be able to speak to them directly without facing the threat of being put into prison, for example, or without the face of persecution or the threat of persecution. And it's a responsibility, because when you have that position of privilege and have that position of power, you have to understand that there are young people who cannot engage with their member states. There are young people who cannot engage with their governments, refugees and stateless people, for example, who are not even recognized by a state. For example, how do they engage with their delegations, for example, or with their decision makers? And often the cases they can't. So how do you then use your position and platform those voices, center those voices? And that's something that we take really seriously. I don't think I yet have a reason to fear for my safety or my security. Very, very lucky to live in a country where our human rights are generally protected in that regard. But it's, again, also thinking that there are people out there whose human rights are not protected, whether they're activists, journalists, whoever it might be, and how do we then support them in the spaces that we occupy is what's really important to us. And that's the reality, is that we're very, very privileged to live the life we live here in the UK. Very privileged.
I think if there's one thing I've learned from you throughout this conversation is that while you are doing great things for yourself, and I know there's going to be challenges in the future, that I feel like you are also a people person where you want to see other people succeed, and that it's not just about you, it's about other people. And I do hope there are more people like you, because too many times I feel like as if we care more about ourselves, but we don't see people that want to see other people involved, or we see but what are other people going through. And you're an example of what it really means to be a leader and a great person. So I'm really grateful to have met you. So Ishaan, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Best of luck in the future. And I hope we meet again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you saw, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at the OMCG Podcast for more information on guests, preview clips, and more. I hope you continue to support this podcast in the future, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next episode.